Mobile County Sheriff's Office.
I believe I've seen a dead person. Their face looks all beat up.
I just couldn't understand why somebody would do that.
There's someone going out and killing people. We don't know what the circumstances are.
We were able to review surveillance videos that show this white SUV heading towards our crime scene.
We needed to interview these 3 people and see where they were on the night of the murder.
Uncle Johnny, he had come by our house.
I have gifts for my birthday, girls. Oh, good to see you.
And he had brought some birthday gifts for our daughter and for my wife, who have a birthday within 7 days of each other. Uncle Johnny was a very fun guy to be around. He was very welcoming, very warm, and very kind.
Here you go. We lived about an hour and 30 minutes from my mother's house in Mobile, Alabama, where my Uncle Johnny, my mother, and my grandmother lived. My Uncle Johnny started working as a flight attendant when he lived in Venezuela. He loved to travel around the world, and he got to meet a lot of people. After my Uncle Johnny stopped being a flight attendant, he moved to the United States and started working in the aerospace company as an interior mechanic. He was very social. He was going on dates, but he didn't have a long-time partner at the time.
Finally found Mr. Right?
No, but hope springs eternal.
Johnny was looking for Mr. Right, if you will.
Maybe one day, yeah.
He had so much to offer, and I think he wanted to share that with someone.
You have a great birthday. Oh, great. See you. Take care. Good to see you. Charlie, gotta go. Don't play later. All right? Say bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Say bye.
Bye-bye.
Dile bye a tío.
Mobile County Sheriff's Office.
There's a cul-de-sac off of Boiler Road. I believe I've seen a dead person laying there.
Okay.
Their face looks all beat up, and they're laying there on their back. I'm pretty sure it's a human. I didn't get out to look. It was freaking me out a little bit.
All right. We'll get a deputy to meet you there, okay?
Thank you, ma'am.
It took 20 to 30 minutes to get to the scene. I was the commander over Criminal Investigations Division. It was in a remote area, so it was clearly a dump job. It was in a dead end of what was going to be a residential area that never really got developed. So there were no cameras or anything in the immediate scene.
Patrol officers secure the location before the investigators arrive.
What do we have here?
Detective Gazier was the lead investigator assigned to this case.
EMS arrived with patrol officers, and they checked the vitals of the victim, and he was pronounced deceased on the scene.
There was lividity and rigor mortis setting in, so we knew that he had been expired for at least a few hours.
The trauma appeared to be a gunshot wound above his right eye.
There was apparent blunt force trauma to his face with teeth missing. His pants pockets had been turned inside out. There was loose change on the ground.
Looking around further, we found the tooth and a toothbridge. We looked for a cell phone and a wallet and could not find one.
There was a debit card lying near the body. which allowed us to quickly identify the victim.
Johnny Sokies. Run it. See what comes up.
We were able to take the name off of the ATM debit card, Mr. Johnny Sokies, and put it into our system. Was able to pull his driver's license picture up and identify him.
Contact the bank, get the bank transaction records.
Our next move was to make contact with Mr. Sokies' family. Johnny's address was about 6 miles away from the crime scene.
Aló.
My grandmother called me
Abuela, ¿qué pasó?
very frantically that morning. The cops knocked on her door, and my grandmother doesn't speak any English, so she gave the investigator the phone.
How can I help?
They told me that my uncle had been murdered.
I'll be right there.
When I arrived at the house, the investigators were there, as well as my husband. And then my mother got home.
Mami, siéntate. Mataron a Johnny.
No. Fue muy difícil, muy doloroso. Johnny era mi hermano. Nos abrazamos y lloramos y no sabíamos qué había pasado.
There's a language barrier with Inui, so Donnie was our translator.
Can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Johnny?
¿Hay alguien que le quiere hacer daño?
No.
Johnny had no enemies. I don't know of anyone that Johnny disagreed with.
Was he in a relationship?
I immediately told them about the dating app and the social media accounts.
Johnny was using the apps to look for relationships and love.
Do you know when he left?
¿Sabe a qué hora se fue?
Inui stated she went to bed around 10 p.m. and Johnny was still watching television. Around 7 a.m., when she woke up, she found Johnny's bedroom door open and the front door unlocked. We asked Inui if Johnny had left in his vehicle, and she said no, that the car was still there. She stated that Johnny had to have left with a friend or someone he knew.
A search of his room and the residence revealed that there was no wallet or cell phone of Mr. Sokies found at his house.
Thank you very much for your help. Here.
Meantime, investigators receive a list of Johnny's bank transactions.
Okay.
We made contact with Wells Fargo, and they provided us with Johnny's last transaction, which was a withdrawal from an ATM about 10 minutes away from Johnny's house. That was made at 3:25 a.m. on the morning Johnny was killed. We also found out that the ATM had surveillance, and they advised they would be sending us those surveillance shots the next morning.
Investigators search Johnny's neighborhood for home security cameras that might reveal when he left home to go to the ATM.
We observed some cameras on a house about 3 houses east of Johnny's residence. We made contact with that resident.
Hey, I'm Deputy Kazir. Can we take a look at the footage from that camera?
We knew Johnny was at the ATM at 3:25, so we started looking at their surveillance footage starting at 3 a.m. She tells us that it's motion activated and that it only picks up when motion such as a vehicle or someone walks by in front of the residence.
Play that part again?
At 3:15, we observed a white mid-sized SUV traveling towards Johnny Soki's house.
Who's behind the wheel?
It didn't show the SUV physically at Mr. Soki's house, but at that particular time, at 3:15 in the morning, most people are asleep. This was the only vehicle in the area.
Pause it there.
The camera captures the partial roadway.
Zoom in there.
We attempted to zoom in to get a description of the driver and the license plate, but it was just too distorted.
We're not able to make out a specific make and model.
We can just get the color of the vehicle and that it was a white SUV.
Play it.
This residence with the surveillance is 3 houses down and just on the opposite side of the street. So we believe as it gets off of the camera angle, it stops at Johnny's residence, picks him up, and then they leave that location.
We knew that he had gotten a ride from someone because we think he's minutes later at the ATM. And this clearly validates that he did leave with another person.
Thanks, Mario.
Investigators review the information from local traffic cameras to try to identify the SUV.
So we gathered data from a tag reader that we have located at Children's Airport near the ATM. The tag reader had picked up a vehicle matching the description from the surveillance camera. This time of morning, that was the only vehicle that passed through the intersection.
We ran the vehicle's license plate to figure out who the registered owner was.
Located that vehicle at an apartment complex, followed that vehicle from the apartment complex to the airport, and then made an investigative stop. I was notified, and then I responded out. There was just one occupant in the vehicle, which was the driver. So I interviewed that individual on the scene at the airport. The driver was identified, and he worked for Allied Taxi Service. I'd asked him if he had picked Johnny up, and he said no. He stated that he'd picked up a couple of fares in the area. I asked him what time. He said he picked up a fare from a hotel and then was at the airport at around 3:25.
I went to the airport to gather surveillance footage.
Let's start from 3:25. There it is. Zoom in there.
The footage showed the taxi driver at the airport at 3:25 dropping fares off.
And we knew that at 3:25, Johnny Soki's and another white SUV were at the Wells Fargo bank withdrawing money. So the taxi driver was telling the truth about what he had done and where he had been. His story was corroborated with video evidence, and he was no longer a person of interest after that.
Okay, thanks.
The next morning, Johnny's family are still coming to terms with what's happened.
No tengo idea por qué un ser humano le quita la vida a otro ser humano, más mi hermano Johnny.
It was very sad and quiet. He was always the loud one, and not having him there and knowing what happened was really hard for all of us.
seeing his bedroom off the corner of the living room. Knowing that he's never going to walk through the door again was the hardest part.
So on October 26th, the day after Johnny Soke's murder, I received the footage from Wells Fargo of Mr. Soke's transaction.
I got images from the bank.
So we're expecting, a full motion video, but this was just still shots of the transaction.
Show me the first one. That's Johnny.
We see Johnny standing at the ATM holding his phone and his wallet. He's wearing a red shirt, the same red shirt that we found him in at the crime scene.
Show me the next image. Zoom in on the background.
And then we also see this white SUV in the background that matched the description of the surveillance that we had captured from Johnny's neighborhood. This is big. At this point, we knew Johnny had his wallet and his phone on him. And then this also confirms the vehicle that we observed in Johnny's neighborhood as being the vehicle that picked him up.
I think I recognize the model.
We was able to key in on a feature on that vehicle. There was a light that was located underneath the side view mirror. So it appeared to be a Lincoln Aviator.
Go to the next one. Who's that?
We can see Johnny Soke's in the video with an unknown black male standing behind him and the white SUV in the background behind that male.
This didn't seem right. This individual standing behind Johnny.
Can you clean it up? This is the best I can get.
We knew that we needed to find out who this individual was.
We want to track where this vehicle came from to look for other video where we could get a visual of the driver of the vehicle.
So at this point, we've established Johnny was picked up at his residence. He had made the withdrawal at the ATM, and then we established the crime scene where Johnny's body was located.
We were able to pull up an aerial map of the subdivision. There's only 2 points of entrance and exit to this neighborhood, and that helped you determine where to canvass for surveillance video.
Deputies searched for security cameras along the route between Johnny's house, the ATM, and the crime scene.
We were able to retrieve surveillance videos from multiple businesses with several different cameras.
Play it.
Palmer's Airport Toyota has a surveillance camera that captures the ATM across the street.
Play that part again. Zoom in there. There goes the Lincoln.
At 324, I see the white Lincoln Aviator pull up across the street at the Wells Fargo ATM. And we can see Johnny walk to the ATM. He goes back to the car.
Once he leaves the ATM, we need to see which route he took to get to Linda Court.
Bring up the next camera.
We're able to almost live time see the progression of where this vehicle goes.
At 3:27 a.m., the Food Mart on Dawes Road captures the white Lincoln Aviator traveling southwest, which is about a mile from the ATM.
pause it there and punch it on the plate.
We were unable to get a tag number off of the white Lincoln Aviator.
What else we got?
At 3:31, we observed the white Lincoln Aviator pass in front of Pete's Place, which is about 1.5 miles from Dahl's Food Mart. The vehicle was traveling southwest toward Linda's Court, where Johnny's body was found. So at this point, we have a clear direction of travel, and we believe Johnny's in the vehicle, who is being driven by a male with a blue shirt who could be Johnny's killer.
Investigators received the report from Johnny's autopsy.
Thanks.
The autopsy report said that Johnny suffered a gunshot wound above his right eye, and there was a .44 Magnum projectile retrieved from his jaw. He was also beaten so badly his dental bridge broke.
Next day, investigators received the report on the GPS data from Johnny's cell.
Give me those locations.
Johnny's first cell phone ping was at 3:21, which tied into the neighbor's surveillance video across the street of him leaving his neighborhood. The phone continued to ping toward the ATM and then along the route that the white SUV took to the crime scene.
At 3:38 a.m., Johnny's phone pings at Linda Court, where the 911 caller finds his body 8 hours later. But this is not the last ping.
At 4:20 a.m., there's one final ping.
Johnny Soki's phone was powered off at 4:20 around Carroll Plantation and Old Pascagoula Road, which is about 10 to 15 miles from Linda Court, where Johnny Soki's body was discovered.
We believe that this is where the suspect could have went after the crime.
Thanks. Speak. I gotta leave. Let's go.
Investigators zero in on the precise location of the final phone ping.
On October 29th, I was in the area of Old Pascagoula and Carroll Plantation Road attempting to locate Johnny Soki's cell phone when I observed a white Lincoln Aviator parked outside some apartments and was able to observe a tag number on the vehicle. I watch a black male and a white female enter the white Lincoln Aviator. At which point they exit the apartment complex and travel west on Old Pascagoula Road. I stayed at the apartment. Other investigators were able to catch up with the vehicle on Old Pascagoula Road.
It pulls into a local convenience store.
81 clear. 8814 clear.
The female gets out. The driver remains in the car, drives away from the business, gets back on Old Pascagoula Road.
Investigators run the Aviator's license plate. The vehicle is registered to a Kenzie Fisher. She is the passenger inside the vehicle that detectives are surveilling.
We were able to find a relationship to that passenger of a black male with the name of Sabrante Rhodes. And we was able to identify the driver being Sabrante Rhodes. With that information, we were also able to ascertain that he had some active warrants on him.
So as I'm observing the apartment complex, the white Lincoln Aviator returns. Minutes later, a car pulls up next to the Lincoln Aviator.
White male gets out of the car, goes over to the vehicle, gets into the passenger side of the Aviator.
The white Lincoln Aviator drives out of the apartment block. They're then observed traveling just down the street to a business complex where they park in front of a business.
So we conducted a traffic stop on that vehicle. We remove Sobrante from the driver's side, and we remove the white male from the passenger side. We detain the two. From that point, we seal the vehicle and we have it towed and impounded. We sent another unit to the convenience store and they detained the female passenger that was dropped off. We needed to interview these 3 people to find out their whereabouts on the night of the murder.
We interviewed the passenger of the white Lincoln Aviator, Connor Moretti.
We asked Connor Moretti who Sobrante Rhodes was to him and how we knew him.
It's the first time I met him. I don't even know his name.
Did you message him or he messaged you?
I messaged him this morning, and then we arranged hookups. Yeah.
Yep.
That's it.
Okay.
He expressed interest. We traded pictures.
It's interesting to see this guy had met Sobrante Rhodes on a dating app, just like Johnny Sokeys did. We asked Connor Moretti if he knew Johnny Sokeys.
Does that guy look familiar to you at all?
He messaged me one time, but I didn't respond.
He's from Venezuela?
I don't know his name. I just know
Would it still be in your phone?
No, because...
How do you know he messaged you?
I remember that face. That's just one of those faces you'll recognize.
You never messaged him back?
Nothing tight.
After a search of Connor Moretti's cell phone, we observed there was no communication between him and Johnny Sokeys on the night of the murder.
This gentleman had no involvement in the murder of Johnny Sokeys.
So we was able to mark him off the suspect list.
Next, investigators interview Sobrante's girlfriend, Kenzie Fisher.
We asked her where she was on the night of October 24th. She said she was home at her apartment.
What time do you go to sleep that night?
9:30.
Okay.
Now, I have trouble sleeping. If he's not in the bed with me, I usually wake up.
She woken up around 2 a.m. and realized Sobrante was gone.
You get up at 2:02 Friday morning. So you got up, okay, you look around, truck's gone.
And she texted him at the time to see where he was.
He was on my way. It's at 2:21.
Some time lapsed, and he was still out. At 3:53 a.m., she texted Sobrante again.
So when you sent this message at 3:53, he's not home yet.
I asked her if she suspected him of messing around outside their relationship.
I do.
What's your suspicions on that?
Having a different female.
Why do you think that?
Because he disappears in the middle of the night.
I asked her if Sobrante was seeing men outside of their relationship.
I've never
suspected him of being like that. Never given you any inclinations that he would be sexually attracted to another male.
Okay.
She was quite surprised. So I showed her the surveillance footage from the ATM.
Just tell us if you recognize the person in the picture, what his name is.
It looks like Sobrante, but I can't make it out.
Yeah. See the vehicle?
Yeah, I do see the vehicle, and that does look like my vehicle.
I felt that she was upfront about her story and where she was that night. She showed us the messages that she was sending Sobrante that night, asking his whereabouts, so that confirmed her alibi. And her messages also confirmed that Sobrante Rhodes was not home on the night of the murder.
Investigators release Sobrante's girlfriend without charge.
Later that day, I interviewed Sobrante Rhodes.
Unrelated to your warrants, we want to talk to you about another case we've been investigating. Or you wouldn't talk to us?
Yeah, I want on a case.
Okay.
We confronted Sobrante about these dating apps. At first, he was standoffish.
Are you bisexual?
Honestly, I'm not bisexual. I have did. Yes, I'm bisexual.
Okay.
So I asked Sobrante Rhodes if he met someone by the name of Johnny on the dating app.
I met him on the chat site.
John.
John who?
I don't know his last name. Hispanic dude.
Sabrante told us that he had picked Johnny up from his house.
Where'd you meet him at?
I met him at his house.
Okay. Did you take him anywhere?
I took him to the ATM machine.
What ATM did I go to?
On Schilling, Fargo.
Wells Fargo?
I took him right back home. I wasn't gone away from my girl no time.
So I asked Sabrante the route that they had taken.
When I went home, I went back up Airport and I walked the way up Schilling.
All the way down Schilling. You ain't got nowhere else?
Nowhere else.
You should have been back home around 3:30, you're saying?
Yeah.
We knew that Sabrante was not telling the truth because we had got video surveillance from Johnny's neighbor that shows Sabrante picking Johnny up but never bringing Johnny back home. So we confronted him with that.
Let me tell you this, okay? We've got you on video going to get Johnny. Got you on video at the ATM with Johnny. Got you on the video leaving the ATM with Johnny. Y'all didn't go directly back home. Y'all went down Dawes Road.
No.
I've got you on video. We've got you on video.
I ain't killed nobody, man. I swear to God.
Did Johnny kill himself? Let me ask you, did Johnny kill himself?
I did not kill nobody, man. I did not take that man nowhere. Oh, God, no, I want a lawyer, man.
So Sabrante Rhodes, at that point, asked for a lawyer, and then we ceased the interview.
So at this point, the interview has stopped. The investigators have enough, at which point our office did approve a murder charge for Sabrante Rhodes.
Investigators inform the family of their progress.
Hi.
The investigators called me and told me that they found a suspect, the suspect that was driving the car that night.
What's his name?
I had never heard of Sabrante before.
Mi hija Donnie me dijo que había un sospechoso. Tuve fe en ellos que iban a resolver la situación.
I feel like it was relief for Donnie and her mom and grandmother.
It was a sigh of relief to know that this individual was off the streets, but there's still a lot of work to do. We knew Johnny died from a single gunshot wound to the head from the .44 Magnum.
Ideally, you'd have the murder weapon, you'd have anything that caused the death. We didn't have a murder weapon in this case.
Finding this weapon was going to be crucial to closing this case.
Sabrante Rhodes is now in jail, and he's communicating via email with his girlfriend. He starts talking about the gun that was used in Johnny's murder and saying that it is in the possession of someone else. I swear I didn't kill this man. When I left him, he was alive. I bet if they run the gun from that 20-year-old kid that did the shooting at ExxonMobil in Theodore gas station the other day, it'd be a match. I don't run with this kid, but I seriously think he killed the man I'm charged with killing. I need to see someone. They got me so wrong. Sabrante Rhodes is saying that someone else was involved in this and that he did not do it.
Investigators review the case file for the shooting that Sabrante describes in his email. They discover that Mobile Police Department arrested 20-year-old Cameron Sullivan for an armed assault at an Exxon gas station 8 days after the murder of Johnny Sokis.
I contacted the case agent working the case, and he gave me the details and told me that they collected a .44 Magnum from that shooting.
The gun was then sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences and tested against the bullet that was recovered from Johnny Sokis. It turned out that it was a match, and that was the gun that was used to kill Johnny Sokis.
Is Sabrante the person that killed Johnny? Or could Cameron Sullivan be Johnny's killer? We interviewed Cameron Sullivan. We asked him about the .44 Magnum.
Cameron Sullivan tells detectives that he purchased the gun recovered from the gas station shooting for $100 on October 26th, the day after Johnny's murder.
He then indicated that he had purchased the gun from Sobrante Rhodes.
Cameron Sullivan told us that he was an associate to Sobrante. We was able to ascertain a phone communication between Cameron Sullivan and Sobrante the day after Johnny Soki's murder.
Have you run his phone GPS?
The cell phone analysis of Cameron Sullivan's phone showed that he was out of state on the morning of the murder.
Thanks.
And so we knew he was not the one that killed Johnny Soki's.
Cameron Sullivan is uninvolved in Johnny's murder. Investigators charge him with no crimes in relation to the killing.
Sobrante Rhodes is trying to evade responsibility for Johnny's death. He clearly knows what happened. He's talking about the gun that was used in the murder. But now he's trying to put the gun and the shooting of Johnny on someone else.
Sobrante Rhodes' murder trial begins on May 15th, 2023. He pleads not guilty. Prosecutor Lauren Walsh sets out the chain of events that led to Johnny's murder.
I think Sobrante Rhodes was living a double, if not a triple life. He had a girlfriend who did not know where he was a lot of the time. He was with all kinds of other people she didn't know about. We know that Johnny and Sobrante were meeting up in the early morning hours of October 25th of 2019. We know that they went to the Wells Fargo ATM together, where they were seen on surveillance and where we know Johnny Soki withdrew cash. Sobrante Rhodes did not take Johnny home after that.
I believe that he robbed him. I believe that he stole from him. And executed him. Sobrante killed Johnny Soki's for no reason at all.
We believe Sobrante Rhodes chose Linda Court to dump Johnny's body because it was quiet and secluded with no witnesses.
We know his pockets were emptied. We know his phone and his wallet were taken. We know that Johnny Soki's phone, it ultimately last connected where Sobrante Rhodes lived.
Johnny's cell phone and wallet was never recovered. We believe when we detained Sobrante and Canamarate that day, Canamarate could very well have been his next victim.
On May 17th, 2023, the jury finds Sobrante Rhodes guilty of intentional murder. The judge sentences him to life without parole.
When we got the verdict, I felt immense gratification and relief that we were able to secure that conviction and get justice, as well as ensure safety for our community so that the public never has to worry about Sobrante Rhodes offending like that again.
He's a very violent person, and he's right where he belongs.
The surveillance footage was immensely important in investigating this case and ultimately securing the conviction of Sobrante Rhodes. It led us to understand where Johnny Soki was, what vehicle he was in, and ultimately who he was with.
I can't understand why this happened to him.
No verlo en la casa, mirar alrededor y no ver sus risas, sus abrazos, sus besos. todos los días de mi vida lo extraño.
Shortly after this tragedy, there was actually some good news. My wife and I found out we were pregnant too. But we weren't ever able to share that with Johnny.
He was a great person and he did not deserve that at all. And we miss him very much.
Next time on See No Evil.
Kansas City 911.
Someone got stuck. Can you come, please?
This is a personal thing.
I shot him twice and then said, remember me, bitch.
If they go inside, we will have them at that point.
It was like the biggest nightmare I've ever had in my life.
The desert keeps secrets better than almost anywhere else on Earth. Wind scrapes across miles of red dirt. Heat presses down like a weight. And when something disappears out there, sometimes it never comes back. In the summer of 1999, the small town of Mesa, Arizona woke up to the kind of headline that only appears in the worst nightmares. A young woman vanished. No warning. No witnesses. No explanation. And for 20 years the case would sit in a dusty evidence locker. A cold case. But that night in 1999, nobody was thinking about the future. Nobody imagined decades of silence. They were just looking for Emily Carter. Emily was 23 years old. A college student. The kind of person people described with the same quiet phrases that always appear in missing person reports. Bright. Friendly. Reliable. She worked evenings at a small bookstore on Main Street, the kind of place that smelled like old paper and coffee. Locals knew her. Regular customers knew her name. And on July 17, 1999, she finished her shift at 9:42 p.m. That detail would later become important. Because 9:42 p.m. was the last confirmed moment anyone ever saw her alive. A co-worker watched her lock the glass front door. Emily waved, walked to her car, a faded blue Honda Civic parked under a flickering streetlight, and drove away into the warm Arizona night. It was a routine drive. 15 minutes home. Straight down Country Club Drive. But Emily Carter never made it there. At first, nobody noticed. Her parents assumed she stayed late with friends. Her roommate thought she might have spent the night with her boyfriend. Hours passed. Midnight turned into 2 in the morning. By sunrise, worry turned into something colder. Emily had not called. She had not come home. Her car was gone. And by 9 a.m., her mother dialed the number every family fears. The missing persons report landed on the desk of Detective Mark Alvarez, a veteran investigator, who had worked dozens of disappearances in the Phoenix metro area. Most of them had explanations. Arguments. Runaways. New lives started somewhere else. But from the very beginning something about Emily Carter's disappearance felt wrong. There were no packed bags. No drained bank account. No goodbye message. Just a girl who finished work, got in her car, and vanished between 2 points on a map. Police began with the obvious. They retraced her route home. Street by street. Block by block. Officers knocked on doors, asked neighbors if they saw anything unusual that night. A car speeding. A scream. A struggle. Nothing. Traffic cameras were almost non-existent in 1999. Cell phone tracking was primitive. Digital breadcrumbs, the kind investigators rely on today, didn't exist. Emily Carter disappeared into the dark like a stone dropped in deep water. 3 days later, the first break came. But it wasn't the kind anyone hoped for. A rancher driving along a dirt road outside Mesa spotted something half-hidden in the brush. A car. Blue. Dust-coated. The license plate matched Emily Carter's Honda Civic. Detectives arrived within the hour. The scene was strange. The car wasn't crashed. It wasn't burned. It wasn't stripped. It was simply abandoned. Driver's door closed. Windows intact. Keys missing. Inside, investigators found Emily's purse lying on the passenger seat. Her wallet still contained cash. Her credit cards untouched. No signs of robbery. No obvious signs of violence. But something was missing. Emily herself. The desert around the vehicle stretched for miles, dry land scattered with cactus and rock. Search teams fanned out in expanding circles, combing the ground for footprints, tire marks, anything. Under the brutal sun, volunteers walked grid patterns across the desert floor. Hours passed. Then days. Helicopters circled overhead. Tracking dogs followed faint scents that vanished into open land. But there was no body. No blood. No trace of Emily Carter anywhere in the Arizona wilderness. For investigators, the case was turning into a nightmare. Because without evidence, every theory was possible. And none of them could be proven. Detective Alvarez built a timeline. Emily left work at 9:42 p.m. Her car was found nearly 18 miles away from the bookstore, far off her normal route home. Which raised the first terrifying question. Why was she out there? Had someone forced her to drive? Had someone else been behind the wheel? Witnesses began coming forward, but their accounts only deepened the mystery. A gas station clerk claimed he saw a blue Honda stop around 10:10 p.m. that night. But he couldn't say who was driving. Another witness believed they saw a man standing near a car on the side of the highway around 10:30 p.m. But from a distance, under weak headlights, faces blur into shadows. Every lead collapsed under scrutiny. Weeks turned into months. Emily's face appeared on flyers across Arizona. Her parents gave emotional interviews on local news stations, begging for information. Tips flooded the police department. Most went nowhere. Some pointed to strangers passing through town. Others suggested darker possibilities. Kidnapping. Stalking. Violence that left no witnesses. And slowly, the case began to fade from headlines. New crimes replaced it. New tragedies took the spotlight. By the year 2000, Emily Carter's disappearance had become something else. A whisper. A mystery people mentioned over coffee. The girl who vanished. But inside the Mesa Police Department, Detective Alvarez refused to let the case go. He studied every page of the file. Phone records. Witness interviews. Maps. There had to be something they missed. One detail kept bothering him. Emily's personal life. At first glance, everything looked normal. She had a boyfriend. Friends. Classes at the community college. A job. But when investigators dug deeper, they uncovered tension beneath the surface. Emily had been arguing with someone in the weeks before she vanished. The problem was nobody could agree on who. Her roommate mentioned a phone argument she overheard late one night. Emily's boyfriend insisted they had been happy. A co-worker claimed Emily seemed nervous recently. But nervous about what? That answer never came. Police questioned everyone in her circle. Friends. Family. Co-workers. No arrests. No suspects strong enough to charge. And slowly, painfully, the investigation began to stall. The desert stayed silent. Months became years. Evidence boxes gathered dust. Detectives moved on to new assignments. And the file labeled Emily Carter, missing person, a possible homicide, slid quietly into a steel cabinet. A cold case. But in Mesa, Arizona, some people never forgot. Because every once in a while, someone driving along that lonely dirt road would glance at the empty desert and remember the story. A young woman. A blue car in the brush. And a question nobody could answer. What really happened on that road in 1999? The answer would stay buried for 23 years. Hidden inside a secret nobody expected. A secret that lived inside a family. And when it finally surfaced, it would lead detectives to a door they never thought to knock on. A door that opened just after midnight. The night the cold case woke up again. Cold cases rarely wake up. Most of them sit quietly in police archives, their pages yellowing, their photographs fading, their witnesses growing older every year. The detectives who once chased every lead move on. Some retire. Some forget details that once kept them awake at night. But every once in a while something small shifts. A name reappears. A memory surfaces. A single sentence cracks open the silence. And that is how the Emily Carter investigation stirred again. Not with a dramatic discovery in the desert. Not with a sudden confession. But with a quiet phone call. It came on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2003. Mesa Police Department's Cold Case Unit had recently been formed, a small team assigned to revisit unsolved crimes that had slipped into the shadows of the 1990s. Detective Lisa Moreno, newly transferred to the unit, had spent her first weeks reading files nobody had opened in years. Emily Carter's case was one of the thickest. 2 full binders of interviews. Hundreds of photographs. Maps covered with red ink. The moment Moreno opened the file, she felt the same thing Detective Alvarez had felt years earlier. Something didn't fit. Emily Carter had vanished from a simple 15-minute drive home. Her car had been discovered miles away, in an isolated area she had no reason to visit. Yet investigators had never identified anyone who could place her there. Someone had to know something. The phone rang while Moreno was reviewing the original witness statements. At first, the call seemed routine. A man's voice. Nervous. Quiet. Almost hesitant. He said he had information about the girl who disappeared in '99. The dispatcher transferred him directly to the cold case unit. Moreno picked up. The caller refused to give his name. He wouldn't say where he was calling from. But he spoke just long enough to plant a seed that investigators could not ignore. Look into her boyfriend again, the man said. Then the line went dead. The boyfriend. It was the most obvious lead investigators had already examined years earlier. Daniel Harper. At the time of Emily's disappearance, Daniel was 26. He worked construction, lived in a small apartment on the south side of Mesa, and had been dating Emily for nearly a year. When police first interviewed him in 1999, he appeared cooperative. Calm. Even sympathetic. He told detectives that he had spent the evening of July 17 at home watching television. No one could confirm it, but he insisted he had not seen Emily that night. He even joined search parties. Helped hand out missing person flyers. Spoke briefly to reporters about how much he missed her. But investigators never found evidence linking him to the disappearance. No witnesses placed him near Emily's car. No physical evidence tied him to the remote desert road where the Honda Civic was discovered. And without proof, suspicion wasn't enough. So Daniel Harper slowly faded from the spotlight. He moved away from Mesa a few years later. The case went cold. Now, 4 years after Emily vanished, a stranger had called police and pointed the finger back at him. Detective Moreno reopened the interview transcripts. Something immediately caught her attention. During Daniel's original questioning in 1999, he had said something unusual. A small detail most investigators overlooked. He told police Emily sometimes liked to drive out into the desert when she felt stressed. At the time, the comment seemed harmless. But Moreno noticed something strange. Emily's friends had never mentioned this habit. Neither had her roommate. In fact, several people insisted Emily hated driving at night outside the city. So why had Daniel described her that way? Moreno dug deeper. She tracked down Emily's old roommate, Sarah Whitman, who now lived in Phoenix. When asked about desert drives, Sarah immediately shook her head. Emily. No way, she said. She hated being alone out there. Moreno then contacted 2 of Emily's college friends. Same answer. Emily didn't wander into the desert at night. Which raised a disturbing possibility. Had Daniel Harper been planting an explanation before anyone even asked the question? Moreno reopened the timeline of July 17. According to Daniel, he last spoke to Emily earlier that afternoon. A normal conversation. Nothing unusual. But phone records from 1999 revealed something investigators hadn't fully explored. Emily had made a short call at 9:58 p.m. 16 minutes after leaving work. The call lasted only 12 seconds. And the number belonged to Daniel Harper. When detectives asked him about it years earlier, he had brushed it off. Probably just saying she was heading home. But the timing suddenly looked different. Emily had already left work. She was already driving. Why would she call him for 12 seconds? And why so close to the moment she disappeared? Moreno began tracking Daniel's life after 1999. It hadn't been particularly remarkable. He moved to Tucson in 2002. Worked various construction jobs. No major criminal record. But one detail stood out. In 2001, Mesa police had briefly questioned him again. Not about Emily. About a domestic disturbance involving another girlfriend. The incident never resulted in charges. But the responding officer's notes described Daniel as agitated and controlling. Moreno felt the same instinct that had pulled detectives back into countless old cases before. Patterns. Violence rarely appears once and disappears forever. It leaves echoes. Still, suspicion wasn't evidence. Moreno needed something stronger. She began re-examining the physical evidence from Emily's abandoned car. In 1999, forensic technology was limited compared to modern standards. Fingerprints had been lifted, but most belonged to Emily. However, the evidence locker still contained items that had never been tested using modern DNA techniques. A hair recovered from the back seat. A partial fingerprint from the passenger door. And fibers collected from the floor mat. Moreno sent everything to the state crime lab. Weeks passed. Then months. Cold cases move slowly. Evidence collected decades earlier must be handled carefully. Some samples degrade. Others vanish entirely under time's quiet erosion. When the first lab report arrived, it wasn't the breakthrough detectives hoped for. The hair did not contain usable DNA. The fibers were inconclusive. But the fingerprint told a different story. The partial print lifted from the passenger door did not belong to Emily Carter. And it did not belong to any of the investigators who handled the vehicle. Which meant one thing. Someone else had been inside that car. Someone who had never been identified. Moreno ran the print through the national database. No match. At least, not yet. But now the investigation had momentum again. And detectives started asking a question that had haunted the case since the beginning. If Emily Carter did not drive into the desert alone, who was with her? That question would slowly lead investigators back toward a truth nobody had considered. A truth hidden not in the desert. Not in the evidence locker. But inside a family that had been quietly carrying a secret for more than 2 decades. And when that secret finally surfaced, it would change everything. Time changes everything in an investigation. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Evidence disappears into forgotten storage rooms. But sometimes time does the opposite. Sometimes it loosens the grip of secrets. By 2004, 5 years had passed since Emily Carter vanished into the Arizona night. The world had moved forward. Technology was changing. DNA analysis was improving. Cold case units across the country were beginning to reopen files that once seemed impossible to solve. Inside the Mesa Police Department, Detective Lisa Moreno continued circling the same unanswered question. Who was in Emily's car? The unidentified fingerprint recovered from the passenger door had become the quiet center of the investigation. It was small, partial, incomplete, but it proved one thing beyond doubt. Emily had not been alone. Moreno stared at the blown-up image pinned to the board in her office. A fragment of a ridge pattern. Swirls and lines frozen in black ink. Someone had touched that door. Someone who had never been identified. The problem was simple. The print didn't match anyone in the national database. Which meant the person who left it had likely never been arrested. Or their prints had never been entered into the system. Moreno began rebuilding the suspect list from the beginning. Friends. Co-workers. Neighbors. Former classmates. Anyone who might have crossed paths with Emily in 1999. One by one, investigators requested voluntary fingerprints. Most people cooperated without hesitation. They wanted answers as much as the police did. Emily Carter's disappearance had left a quiet scar on the community. Weeks passed. Then months. The fingerprint comparisons came back the same every time. No match. Still, something about the case refused to settle. Moreno returned to Daniel Harper, Emily's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. He remained the one person investigators could not fully eliminate. But proving suspicion was a different matter. In 2004, detectives traveled to Tucson to speak with him again. Daniel answered the door of a small rented house on the edge of town. He looked older than the photographs in the file. Thinner. More tired. But when Moreno introduced herself, his expression barely changed. He had expected this day. Cold cases have a strange gravity. The people involved often know the story will eventually return. They sat at a kitchen table. The recorder clicked on. Moreno began with the same simple questions investigators had asked 5 years earlier. Where were you on July 17, 1999? Daniel gave the same answer. Home. Alone. Watching television. Did Emily call you that night? Yes, he said calmly. Just to say she was heading home. Maureen leaned forward slightly. The call lasted 12 seconds. Daniel shrugged. Maybe the signal cut out. It was the kind of answer that sounded reasonable, but felt rehearsed. Maureen shifted the conversation. You told detectives in 1999 that Emily sometimes liked driving into the desert. Daniel nodded. She did. Said it helped her think. Maureen studied his face carefully, because she now knew that no one else had ever confirmed that claim. Not her friends. Not her roommate. Not her family. Still, Daniel spoke about it like it was common knowledge. Did you ever go with her? Maureen asked. Once or twice, he replied. Where exactly? Daniel hesitated. Just for a second. Then he shook his head. Some dirt roads outside town. I don't remember the names. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Daniel never lost his composure. Never contradicted himself. And when detectives asked if he would provide fingerprints to help eliminate him from the investigation, he agreed without hesitation. 2 days later, the results came back. The unidentified print from Emily's car did not match Daniel Harper. Once again, the investigation slid into uncertainty. Maureen sat alone in the cold case office late one evening, staring at the wall of photographs that documented Emily Carter's life. Graduation pictures. Family gatherings. Snapshots from college parties. A smiling young woman frozen forever at 23. Somewhere inside that timeline, something had gone terribly wrong. But the trail kept dissolving. Then another small detail surfaced. A name buried deep in the original witness interviews. Someone investigators had spoken to only once in 1999. A co-worker from the bookstore. Rachel Dunn. At the time, Rachel had been 19 years old. A part-time employee who worked the register on weekends. Her original statement had seemed insignificant. She told police she remembered Emily receiving a phone call earlier on the day she disappeared. Emily had stepped outside to take it. When she came back inside, Rachel said Emily looked unsettled. Not frightened, but distracted. The kind of subtle change people notice only in hindsight. Back in 1999, detectives asked Rachel if she overheard the conversation. She said no. But she did remember one strange thing. Emily had asked to leave work a little earlier than usual that night. Which raised a quiet question. Was Emily planning to meet someone? Maureen tracked Rachel Dunn down to a suburb outside Phoenix. The young bookstore clerk from 1999 was now a mother in her late 20s. When Maureen mentioned Emily Carter's name, Rachel went silent for a moment. Then she said something detectives had never recorded before. I didn't tell police everything back then. Maureen felt the familiar tightening of anticipation. What didn't you tell them? Rachel looked uncomfortable. I wasn't sure it mattered. But sometimes the smallest details change everything. Rachel took a slow breath. That day when Emily got the phone call, she argued with someone. Maureen's attention sharpened. Did you hear the name of the person she was arguing with? Rachel shook her head. No. But she said something that stuck with me. What was it? Rachel hesitated again. Then she repeated the sentence exactly as she remembered it. You can't keep this secret forever. The words hung in the air. A secret. Maureen felt the investigation shifting again. Did Emily say who she was talking about? She asked. Rachel shook her head slowly. No. But I remember she looked really upset. Scared. Rachel thought for a moment. Not scared, more like angry. Maureen wrote the sentence in her notebook. You can't keep this secret forever. If Emily had been confronting someone, what secret was she talking about? And who was she confronting? For years investigators had focused on strangers. Kidnappers. Random violence. But now the case seemed to be pointing somewhere much closer. Closer than the desert road. Closer than the abandoned car. Closer even than her boyfriend. Somewhere inside Emily Carter's personal life there had been a secret. A secret important enough to trigger a confrontation. A secret someone might have been desperate to keep buried. And if that secret still existed, it meant someone out there had been carrying it for 23 years. Waiting. Hoping the truth would never come out. Secrets have a strange way of surviving. Even when the people involved move away. Even when decades pass. They linger quietly inside conversations, inside memories people try not to revisit. And sometimes, when investigators start asking the right questions, those buried fragments begin to surface again. Detective Lisa Moreno returned to the cold case office, with Rachel Dunn's statement echoing in her mind. You can't keep this secret forever. It was the first time in 5 years of investigation that the Emily Carter case had pointed directly toward a hidden conflict. Someone had been keeping something from Emily. Something serious enough for her to confront them. Something serious enough that it might have ended with her disappearance. Moreno spread the case files across her desk again, but this time she looked at them through a different lens. Not as a random crime, but as a confrontation that escalated. She built a new timeline for the day Emily vanished. Morning. Classes at Mesa Community College. Afternoon. A phone call that upset her at work. Evening. A 12-second call to her boyfriend while driving home. Then silence. If Emily had discovered a secret, the next logical question was obvious. Whose secret was it? Moreno started with the people closest to her. Friends. Co-workers. Boyfriend. Family. Every name in the file suddenly carried a different weight. The Carter family lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Mesa, a place where the lawns were trimmed, the streets were calm, and neighbors waved politely as they walked their dogs. To most people, Emily's family had always seemed stable. Ordinary. Her parents, Robert and Linda Carter, had spent years pleading for answers after their daughter vanished. They had spoken to reporters. Organized search efforts. Worked closely with detectives during the early stages of the investigation. But now Moreno returned to them with a new set of questions. She scheduled an interview at their home. The house looked exactly like the photographs from 1999. Same white porch railing. Same small desert garden out front. Only the people inside had changed. Robert Carter had aged heavily. His hair had turned almost completely gray. Linda looked exhausted in the quiet way parents of missing children often do, the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of unanswered questions. Moreno explained that the investigation had been reopened. They listened carefully. Then she asked the question that had been waiting inside the case file for years. Was Emily dealing with any family problems before she disappeared? Both parents exchanged a quick glance. A small movement. But Moreno noticed it immediately. Robert spoke first. No. Nothing unusual. Linda nodded quietly beside him. Moreno let the silence sit for a moment. Then she pushed slightly deeper. Did Emily ever argue with anyone in the family? Robert shook his head. Not really. Normal disagreements, I guess. Normal. The word lingered in the room. Maureen asked about Emily's schedule in the weeks before her disappearance. Her parents described routine details. School. Work. Friends visiting the house. Everything sounded normal. But Maureen had conducted enough interviews to recognize when people were holding something back. It wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't say. When the conversation shifted toward Emily's personal life, Linda Carter became noticeably quieter. Her hands folded together in her lap. Her eyes drifted toward the floor. Maureen gently asked another question. Did Emily ever mention being upset about a secret someone was keeping from her? The reaction was immediate. Linda froze. Robert shifted in his chair. The room suddenly felt smaller. It was a subtle change, but investigators are trained to see these moments. Maureen kept her voice calm. If there's something you didn't mention back then, it could be important now. Robert sighed slowly. 23 years of silence seemed to press down on the room. Finally, Linda spoke. There was something. Robert looked at her quickly. A warning in his expression. But she continued anyway. Emily had been arguing with her brother. The name appeared in the original file, but only briefly. Michael Carter. Emily's older brother. At the time of her disappearance, he was 28. A mechanic at a local auto shop. Investigators had spoken with him once in 1999, but he had never been considered a serious suspect. Maureen leaned forward slightly. What were they arguing about? Linda hesitated. I'm not sure exactly. Emily said Michael had gotten himself into trouble. What kind of trouble? Linda shook her head. She wouldn't say. Maureen turned to Robert. Do you remember those arguments? Robert looked uncomfortable. They fought sometimes, he admitted. But siblings fight. The explanation sounded rehearsed. Maureen pressed gently. Did the arguments happen close to the time Emily disappeared? Another pause. Then Robert nodded slowly. Yes. How close? Maybe a week before. Now the timeline was tightening. Emily argued with someone on the phone the day she vanished. Earlier that week, she had been arguing with her brother. And according to Rachel Dunn, Emily had confronted someone about a secret. Maureen asked the obvious question. Where was Michael Carter on July 17, 1999? Robert answered quickly. At work. Do you know what time his shift ended? I think around 9. Maureen wrote it down. 9 o'clock. Emily left work at 9:42 p.m. The time windows overlapped. Did Michael ever speak with Emily that night? Maureen asked. Robert shook his head. Not that I know of. The interview ended politely, but the atmosphere had shifted. As Maureen walked back to her car, she replayed the conversation in her mind. The tension between the parents. Linda's hesitation. Robert's careful answers. Families often protect each other, sometimes even from the truth. But the idea that Emily had been confronting her brother about a secret just days before disappearing was impossible to ignore. Maureen returned to the station and pulled Michael Carter's original interview transcript from the evidence archive. The document was thin. Too thin. In 1999, detectives had asked him only basic questions. He claimed he had been working late at the auto shop the night Emily vanished. No one had verified the timeline thoroughly. Back then, investigators were focused on other leads. Strangers. Kidnappers. Boyfriends. Michael Carter had slipped quietly through the investigation. But now, with the word secret hanging over the case, the focus shifted. Moreno ran a background check on him. The results were interesting. In 2000, less than a year after Emily disappeared, Michael Carter had been arrested for possession of stolen vehicle parts. The charge had been reduced later. But the arrest report described him as someone connected to a small local car theft ring. Moreno stared at the report for a long moment. Car theft. Stolen parts. A mechanic. Then another detail clicked into place. Emily's car had been found abandoned in the desert. No keys. No explanation. What if Emily had discovered something involving her brother? Something illegal. Something dangerous. And what if she had confronted him about it? Suddenly the investigation was pointing somewhere much closer to home than anyone had ever imagined. Moreno closed the file slowly. For 23 years, the mystery of Emily Carter had been treated as a disappearance that began on a lonely desert road. But maybe the story had started somewhere else entirely. Inside a family argument. Inside a secret someone didn't want exposed. And if that secret was still alive after all these years, it meant the person protecting it had been living quietly among them the entire time. The most dangerous suspects in a cold case are often the ones investigators dismissed too early. They exist quietly in the margins of the file. Names that appear only once or twice. Interviews that lasted 20 minutes and were never revisited. For 23 years, Michael Carter had been one of those names. Emily's older brother. A mechanic. A man who told detectives in 1999 that he loved his sister and had no idea what happened to her. Now Detective Lisa Moreno was reading his original interview again, and this time every sentence felt different. The transcript had been taken 3 days after Emily's car was discovered in the desert. Michael had walked into the police station voluntarily. Calm. Cooperative. Concerned. He told investigators he had been working the night Emily vanished. The auto shop where he worked stayed open late during the summer. He claimed he finished around 9:15 p.m., then went home. Alone. No witnesses. The detective who interviewed him back then had asked a few follow-up questions. Did he speak to Emily that day? Michael said yes, briefly in the morning. Did she seem upset about anything? No, he answered. Did they argue recently? No. That answer now carried a different weight. Because Emily's parents had just admitted something investigators never recorded in the file. Emily and Michael had been arguing. Repeatedly. The conflict had been serious enough for Emily to mention that her brother was in trouble. Moreno leaned back in her chair. If Michael Carter had lied about those arguments, what else had he lied about? She called the auto shop where Michael had worked in 1999. The building was still there on the edge of Mesa, though ownership had changed twice since then. An elderly man named Victor Ramirez, the former owner, answered the phone. Moreno asked if he remembered Michael Carter. There was a pause. Then Ramirez laughed quietly. Hard to forget that kid, he said. Moreno felt the first hint of tension in his voice. What do you remember about him? She asked. He was a good mechanic, Ramirez replied slowly. But he ran with the wrong people. Moreno asked if Michael had been working the night Emily disappeared. Ramirez hesitated. That was a long time ago, he said. Yes, Moreno replied calmly. But it was an important night. Another pause stretched across the line. Finally Ramirez spoke again. I don't think he worked that late. Moreno's pen stopped moving. You're not sure? No, Ramirez said. But most Saturdays we closed around 8. 8? Emily left work at 9:42 p.m. Michael had told detectives he worked until 9:15. If the shop closed at 8, his alibi was suddenly fragile. Moreno drove to the old shop the next morning. Ramirez met her outside the building. He moved slowly now, his shoulders rounded with age, but his memory seemed sharp. Inside the dusty office, Moreno laid the original report on the desk. Do you remember the police asking about Michael's shift that night? She asked. Ramirez studied the paper. No, he said finally. I don't think they ever called me. That answer changed the investigation instantly. Michael Carter's alibi had never been verified. Not once. For 23 years, detectives had simply accepted his word. Moreno asked Ramirez another question. Did Michael ever get involved in stolen car parts? Ramirez gave a small, tired smile. Everybody in this business hears things. Did you hear things about him? Ramirez nodded slowly. There were rumors. He leaned back in his chair, looking out toward the garage floor where mechanics once worked. Late 90s there was a group stealing cars around Mesa. Chop shops. Parts getting sold all over the valley. And Michael. He knew some of the guys, Ramirez said carefully. Moreno thought about Emily's abandoned Honda Civic sitting in the desert brush. A car connected to a mechanic involved in stolen parts. The coincidence was uncomfortable. Did you ever see Michael driving Emily's car? Moreno asked. Ramirez frowned slightly. Once or twice, maybe. When? Before she disappeared. Moreno's mind began stitching the fragments together. Emily arguing with her brother. A secret he was keeping. His connection to stolen vehicles. Her car found abandoned in the desert. And the missing keys. The missing keys bothered Moreno more than anything. When police discovered the Honda Civic in 1999, the keys were gone. Not dropped. Not left inside. Removed. Which meant someone had driven that car away from the scene. Someone who didn't want investigators to know where it came from. A mechanic involved in stolen vehicles would know exactly how to move a car without leaving obvious traces. Moreno returned to the cold case office with a growing sense that the investigation had been pointed in the wrong direction for decades. Not toward strangers. Not toward kidnappers. But toward someone who knew Emily intimately. Someone who had the skills to move her car and abandon it without attracting attention. Someone inside her own family. The next step was obvious. Michael Carter needed to be interviewed again. But before confronting him directly, Moreno wanted more. Something concrete. She pulled his criminal history again. The arrest from 2000 for possession of stolen vehicle parts had been dismissed after a plea agreement. But the police report contained something interesting. The arrest occurred after officers searched a small garage Michael had been renting outside Mesa. Inside they found dismantled car components from multiple vehicles. Engines. Doors. License plates. The operation looked like a low-level chop shop. Moreno stared at the list of recovered items. Then she noticed something strange. Among the vehicles mentioned in the report there was no record of a blue Honda Civic. But that didn't necessarily mean anything. Stolen cars are often dismantled quickly. Parts scattered. VIN numbers removed. Still, the connection lingered. Emily Carter's car had been abandoned intact in the desert. Which raised another question. Why abandon it? If Michael had been involved in car theft, he could have dismantled it. Sold the parts. Made it disappear. But he didn't. Instead, the car had been left in the open. Hidden, but not destroyed. As if whoever left it there needed to get rid of it quickly. Maureen felt the investigation shifting again. Maybe Emily's disappearance wasn't connected to the car theft operation directly. Maybe the car was simply the aftermath. The result of something that happened unexpectedly. A confrontation. An argument. A moment that spiraled out of control. Maureen opened the caseboard and pinned Michael Carter's photograph beside Emily's. The siblings looked similar. Same dark hair. Same sharp cheekbones. But the expressions were different. Emily's picture captured a bright smile. Michael's mugshot from 2000 carried a colder look. Years had passed since that photograph. But somewhere in Arizona, Michael Carter was still living his life. Working. Sleeping. Carrying the same memories from the summer of 1999. Memories that might finally be catching up to him. Maureen closed the file slowly. For 23 years, Emily Carter had been treated as a missing person. A mystery lost somewhere in the desert. But the deeper detectives dug, the clearer something became. The truth might never have been buried in the desert at all. It might have been buried inside a family secret. A secret that had survived decades. A secret one man had managed to keep hidden long enough for everyone else to stop asking questions. But cold cases have patience. And now, after all those years, the investigation was finally circling back to him. When a cold case begins to move again, it rarely happens all at once. There's no sudden explosion of answers. No dramatic confession out of nowhere. Instead, the investigation creeps forward in small, careful steps, like someone walking through a dark room, feeling the walls, searching for a door. Detective Lisa Maureen now had a new direction. For the first time in 23 years, Emily Carter's disappearance was pointing clearly toward someone inside her own family. Michael Carter. The older brother. The mechanic. The man whose alibi had never been verified. But suspicion alone would never solve the case. Cold cases collapse under weak assumptions. Maureen needed evidence, something solid enough to survive decades of silence. So she began reconstructing Michael Carter's life after 1999. The records showed a pattern that felt familiar to investigators who study long-term offenders. Michael had moved several times during the early 2000s. Mesa. Then Tucson. Then a brief period in Flagstaff. Each move seemed tied to a different job, mostly mechanical work, sometimes construction. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed violence. But people who knew him described something else. Temper. Short bursts of anger. A habit of disappearing for days when things went wrong. Maureen contacted a former co-worker, who had worked with Michael in Tucson around 2004. The man, Darren Cole, remembered him immediately. Quiet guy, Darren said over the phone. But you didn't want to push him. What do you mean? Maureen asked. He had a fuse, Darren replied. Short one. Maureen asked if Michael ever talked about his sister. There was a pause. Yeah, Darren said slowly. Once or twice. What did he say? Just that she disappeared. Said the cops wasted years chasing the wrong people. The comment was strange. Most family members of missing persons don't speak about investigations with that kind of distance. Moreno asked another question. Did he ever mention the desert? Darren hesitated. Actually, yeah. Moreno felt the investigation tighten. What did he say about it? Just that he liked driving out there sometimes, Darren said. Said it helped him clear his head. The words echoed something from the old file. In 1999, Michael's brother-in-law had told police that Michael sometimes went on long drives outside the city late at night. At the time, the detail had seemed meaningless. But now it felt different. Emily's car had been found deep in the desert. A place Michael might have known well. Moreno returned to the evidence photographs taken the day the Honda Civic was discovered. The car sat tilted slightly in the dirt, surrounded by scrub brush and cactus. Investigators in 1999 had described the area as remote. But when Moreno looked closer at the maps, she noticed something surprising. The dirt road leading to the location wasn't random. It connected to a network of trails often used by locals who knew the desert. Hunters, off-road drivers, people familiar with the landscape. Someone who had never been out there before might struggle to find that exact spot at night. But someone who grew up in Mesa, someone who spent time driving the desert roads. They would know it. Moreno decided it was time to see the place herself. The sun was setting when she drove the same dirt road investigators had followed decades earlier. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Wind rustled through dry brush. The silence felt heavy. She parked near the location where Emily's car had been discovered in July of 1999. The scene looked almost unchanged. Just open land. Nothing that hinted at violence. Nothing that explained how a young woman had vanished without leaving a trace. Moreno stepped out of the car. The air smelled like dust and heat. For a moment, she simply stood there, imagining the events of that night. Emily driving down the road. Maybe arguing with someone. Maybe frightened. Maybe realizing too late that something had gone terribly wrong. The question that haunted investigators for years returned again. Why here? Why abandon the car in this exact spot? Moreno walked slowly along the edge of the dirt road. Then she noticed something unexpected. Tracks. Not fresh tire marks, the desert erased those long ago. But signs that the area was more familiar than investigators once believed. Beer bottles half buried in the sand. An old fire pit surrounded by stones. The place had been used before. By locals. By people who knew this quiet corner of land. Moreno returned to the station with a new thought forming. What if the location where Emily's car was abandoned wasn't random at all? What if it was a place someone already knew? Someone comfortable enough to drive there in the dark. Someone who had been there many times before. The investigation now needed to focus on Michael Carter's connection to that area. Moreno began searching for anyone who might have visited the desert with him. Old friends. Former co-workers. People who knew his habits in the late 1990s. One name appeared again and again in those conversations. Jason Miller. Jason had been one of Michael's closest friends during that time. The two men worked together occasionally, and were known to spend weekends driving off-road vehicles outside Mesa. Moreno tracked Jason down in a small town outside Phoenix. He agreed to meet at a diner just off the highway. Jason looked surprised when Moreno mentioned Emily Carter. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. Yes, Moreno replied. But we're looking at the case again. Jason stirred his coffee nervously. Moreno asked if he and Michael used to drive into the desert together. Jason nodded. Sometimes. Did you ever go to the area near where Emily's car was found? Jason frowned. I'm not sure exactly where that was. Moreno slid a map across the table. Jason studied it for a moment. Then his expression changed. You mean this road? He tapped a spot on the map. It was the exact dirt road where the Honda Civic had been discovered. Yes, Moreno said calmly. Jason leaned back in his seat. Yeah, we went there a few times. The answer landed like a quiet shock. How often? Moreno asked. Couple times a month back then. What did you do out there? Just drove around. Bonfires. Stuff like that. Moreno let the silence stretch. Then she asked the question that had been waiting for years. Was Michael with you the night Emily disappeared? Jason froze. For the first time since the conversation began, the confidence in his voice vanished. I don't remember, he said quickly. Moreno watched him carefully. People forget things over time. But sometimes forgetting looks different. Sometimes it looks like fear. And Jason Miller suddenly looked very afraid. Because if Michael Carter had been driving those desert roads the night Emily vanished, then the abandoned car might not have been a mystery at all. It might have been exactly where he intended to leave it. Fear changes the way people remember things. Sometimes it erases details. Sometimes it locks them away for years. And sometimes, when investigators begin pulling at the edges of an old case, that fear resurfaces all at once. Jason Miller had started the conversation calmly enough. Just another former friend remembering old desert drives and weekends spent outside Mesa. But the moment Detective Lisa Moreno placed that map on the diner table, everything shifted. Jason recognized the road instantly. The same road where Emily Carter's car had been found in 1999. Now his hands moved restlessly around the coffee cup in front of him. Moreno didn't rush him. Cold cases require patience. The truth often emerges slowly, one uncomfortable detail at a time. You said you and Michael went out there a few times, she said quietly. Jason nodded. Yeah. Did you go there often in the summer of 1999? Another nod. Sometimes. Moreno leaned forward slightly. Jason, think carefully. Was Michael out there the night Emily disappeared? The diner seemed unusually quiet. Outside, cars moved along the highway, their headlights sliding past the windows in slow streaks. Jason stared at the map again. Then he exhaled. I don't know, he said. It sounded like the kind of answer investigators hear every day. But Moreno noticed something important. Jason wasn't saying no. He was saying he didn't know. She decided to change the angle. When did you last see Michael that weekend? Jason rubbed his forehead. Saturday afternoon, I think. That would have been July 17th. Yeah. What were you doing? Working on his truck. Moreno wrote the note down. Where? His garage. Did Emily stop by? Jason hesitated. Then nodded slowly. Yeah, actually she did. Moreno felt the investigation tighten again. This was the first time anyone had placed Emily with her brother on the day she disappeared. What time? She asked. Jason frowned, trying to reconstruct the moment. Late afternoon, maybe around 5 or 6. What happened? Jason looked uncomfortable. They argued. Maureen waited. Jason continued. Not yelling exactly, but you could tell it was serious. What were they arguing about? Jason shook his head. I couldn't hear everything. But you heard something. Jason nodded reluctantly. Emily kept saying he needed to tell the truth. The words landed heavily. Tell the truth. Maureen felt the pattern forming. Earlier that week, Emily had confronted someone about a secret. Now Jason was describing another confrontation. Emily telling her brother he needed to come clean. What truth? Maureen asked quietly. Jason stared at the table. I don't know. Did Michael say anything? Jason hesitated again. Then he spoke slowly. He told her to stay out of it. Out of what? Jason's voice dropped. I think she found out about the cars. The cars. Maureen's mind snapped back to the arrest report from 2000. Stolen vehicle parts. Chop shop rumors. What exactly did she find out? Maureen asked. Jason looked around the diner nervously, as if someone might overhear. Michael was helping move stolen cars, he said. How? Driving them out into the desert sometimes. The desert. The exact place where Emily's Honda Civic had been found. Maureen's pen stopped moving for a moment. Why the desert? Jason shrugged. Temporary storage. Sometimes they'd strip them later. The explanation suddenly cast the abandoned Civic in a completely different light. Emily's car had been discovered miles away from her normal route home. In an area known to Michael and his friends. An area used for illegal activity. What happened after the argument? Maureen asked. Jason took a long breath. Emily left. Did Michael go after her? Jason hesitated. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah. How long after she left? Maybe 10 minutes. And where did he say he was going? Jason looked directly at Maureen for the first time since the conversation began. He said he was going to talk to her. The words hung in the air. Talk to her. That was the last known confrontation, before Emily Carter disappeared forever. Maureen asked the question she had been building toward. Did you see Michael again that night? Jason shook his head quickly. No. But you spoke to him later. Yeah, the next day. What did he say? Jason swallowed. He asked if the police had come by yet. Maureen felt a chill run through her. Why would he ask that? Jason shrugged helplessly. I didn't know at the time. Did he say where he had been? Jason nodded slowly. He said he went driving. Where? Jason didn't answer immediately. Instead he looked down at the map on the table. His finger moved toward the same dirt road again. The same road investigators had followed 23 years earlier. He said he drove out there. The desert road. The place where Emily's car would later be discovered. Maureen leaned back slightly. Jason, did Michael seem worried? Jason nodded. Yeah. Why? Jason stared at the map again. I think he thought Emily might tell someone about the cars. The secret. Emily had discovered something about her brother's illegal activity. She confronted him. He chased after her. And hours later her car appeared abandoned in the desert. Maureen asked one final question. Jason, did Michael ever say what happened when he caught up with her? Jason's face tightened. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he shook his head slowly. No. But his eyes told a different story. Because sometimes people don't say what they remember. They say what they wish had never happened. And Jason Miller suddenly looked like a man who had been carrying someone else's secret for a very long time. A secret tied to a desert road. A secret tied to a missing sister. A secret that might finally be close to breaking open after more than 2 decades of silence. For more than 20 years, the Emily Carter investigation had moved in circles. Leads appeared. Leads vanished. Suspicions drifted toward strangers, toward passing vehicles, toward faceless criminals who might have crossed paths with a young woman driving home on a summer night. But after the conversation with Jason Miller, the entire story began to look different. Not random. Not mysterious. Personal. Painfully personal. Detective Lisa Moreno returned to the cold case office late that evening and pinned a new timeline across the investigation board. The pieces were finally starting to align. Late afternoon, July 17, 1999. Emily Carter arrives at her brother Michael's garage. Jason Miller is there working on a truck. An argument breaks out. Emily accuses Michael of hiding something. A secret. Stolen cars. Illegal activity. She tells him he needs to tell the truth. Michael tells her to stay out of it. Emily leaves. 10 minutes later, Michael gets in his own vehicle and follows her. The next confirmed sighting of Emily is at 9:42 p.m., leaving the bookstore. 16 minutes later, she makes a 12-second call to her boyfriend. After that silence. And sometime during that night, her blue Honda Civic ends up abandoned on a desert road Michael knew well. Moreno stared at the timeline for a long moment. It was the first version of events that made sense. But one critical piece was still missing. Emily's body had never been found. Without that, prosecutors would have a difficult time moving forward. Cold cases often collapse in court when the victim is missing. Defense attorneys build doubt. They suggest the person ran away, started a new life, vanished voluntarily. Moreno needed more than suspicion. She needed proof that something violent had happened in that desert. The evidence team reopened the original forensic photographs from the Honda Civic. In 1999, investigators had searched the car thoroughly. They found Emily's purse, her wallet, her credit cards. But no blood. No clear sign of a struggle. At the time, that lack of evidence helped push detectives away from the idea of murder. But forensic science had changed dramatically in the years since then. Moreno requested a full re-examination of the vehicle. The Honda Civic had been sitting in a secured police storage facility for decades, dusty, faded, but still intact. Under modern forensic lighting, investigators began scanning every inch of the interior. Seats, door handles, floor panels. For hours they found nothing. Then one technician noticed something unusual along the edge of the trunk lining. A faint discoloration. Barely visible to the naked eye. They removed the lining carefully and applied a chemical reagent designed to reveal traces of blood invisible to normal light. Slowly, a pattern appeared. Small specks. Almost microscopic. But unmistakable. Blood. The lab confirmed the results 2 days later. The blood belonged to Emily Carter. For the first time in 23 years, investigators had physical evidence that she had been injured inside her own car. The discovery changed everything. Emily Carter was no longer just a missing person. She was almost certainly a homicide victim. Moreno immediately requested a warrant to obtain Michael Carter's DNA. Because the next question was unavoidable. If Emily bled inside that car, who was with her? Detectives tracked Michael to a small house outside Tucson. He had lived there quietly for years. Neighbors described him as reserved. A man who kept to himself. No one mentioned violence. No one mentioned a missing sister. But as investigators approached the house with the warrant, the weight of the moment settled over them. 23 years of unanswered questions. 23 years of silence. And now the investigation was finally closing in. Michael answered the door wearing jeans and a faded work shirt. He looked older than the photographs from the early 2000s. But his expression remained steady when detectives introduced themselves. Michael Carter. Moreno asked. Yes. We're reopening the investigation into your sister Emily's disappearance. For the first time, a flicker crossed his face. Not panic. Something colder. Resignation. He didn't resist when detectives explained the DNA warrant. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and allowed the technician to swab the inside of his cheek. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes. But as investigators drove away, Moreno couldn't shake the feeling that Michael understood exactly what was happening. Because if his DNA appeared inside Emily's car, the entire story he told in 1999 would collapse. The lab results arrived 12 days later. Moreno opened the report slowly. One line jumped out immediately. A second DNA profile had been recovered from the trunk area of the Honda Civic. A male profile. Partially degraded, but still strong enough for comparison. She flipped to the final page. Match confirmed. Michael Carter. His DNA was inside the trunk of Emily's car. The room fell silent as the team absorbed the result. For decades, investigators had wondered who was with Emily the night she vanished. Now they had the answer. Her brother. But the discovery raised an even darker question. Why was his DNA inside the trunk? People don't usually place living relatives in the trunk of a car. Moreno stared at the evidence report again. The blood pattern inside the trunk suggested movement. Contact. Possible attempts to clean the area. Which meant something terrible had likely happened in that vehicle. And someone had tried to hide it. The case that once looked like a mysterious disappearance in the desert was now transforming into something far more disturbing. A confrontation between siblings. A secret involving stolen cars. A chase into the Arizona night. And a violent moment that ended with Emily Carter bleeding inside her own vehicle. But one piece of the puzzle still remained missing. Emily herself. Because if Michael Carter had placed his sister in the trunk of that car, then somewhere out in the Arizona desert, there had to be a place where he left her. The moment investigators confirmed Michael Carter's DNA inside the trunk of Emily's car, the cold case stopped being a mystery. It became a countdown. Because once evidence reaches that level, suspects start to feel the pressure. And people under pressure make mistakes. Detective Lisa Moreno understood that better than most. 23 years had passed since Emily Carter disappeared, but now the investigation was finally closing in on the truth. The forensic evidence had shifted the case from suspicion to something far more dangerous for Michael Carter. His DNA was in the trunk. Emily's blood was there too. That single combination told a story prosecutors could build around. But Moreno still needed one final piece. A body. Or a location. Something that would explain what happened after Emily was placed in the trunk of that Honda Civic. The team returned to the desert road where the car had been found. This time the search wasn't casual. This time it was methodical. Cadaver dogs were brought in, animals trained to detect the faint scent of human decomposition even after decades. The Arizona desert is brutal to evidence. Heat accelerates decay. Wind moves sand and soil across the landscape, slowly burying traces of what once happened there. But the desert also preserves things in strange ways. Sometimes bones remain long after everything else disappears. The search grid spread outward from the location where the car had been discovered in 1999. Investigators walked slowly across the rough terrain. Hour after hour. Day after day. Nothing. No clothing. No bones. No shallow grave. Moreno stood at the edge of the search zone one evening watching the sun fall behind the desert hills. The silence out there felt endless. If Michael Carter had left Emily's body somewhere in this landscape, he had chosen his location carefully. Or he had moved her somewhere else entirely. The possibility forced Moreno to reconsider the timeline again. Emily disappeared sometime after 9:58 p.m. Her car was discovered the next morning by a rancher, abandoned miles from the highway. Which meant Michael had hours during the night to do whatever he needed to do. Plenty of time. Plenty of darkness. The investigation shifted toward Michael's movements after that night. Phone records from 1999 were limited, but investigators managed to recover one interesting detail. Michael had made a short call at 12:17 a.m. Just over 2 hours after Emily's last known contact. The number belonged to Jason Miller. Moreno drove back to Phoenix to speak with Jason again. This time the conversation felt different. The evidence had changed everything. Jason sat across from her in a quiet interview room, looking exhausted before the questions even began. "You spoke to Michael the night Emily disappeared," Moreno said. Jason nodded slowly. "Yeah. At 12:17 a.m. Another nod. "What did he say?" Jason stared at the table. "He asked if anyone had been asking about him." Moreno waited. "What else?" Jason rubbed his hands together nervously. "He sounded weird." "Weird how?" "Breathing hard. Like he'd been driving." "Did he tell you where he was?" Jason hesitated. Then he nodded once. "He said he was out past the old quarry." Moreno's attention sharpened instantly. The old quarry. It was a location investigators had never connected to the case before. "Where exactly is that?" she asked. Jason leaned forward and drew a rough map on a notepad. The quarry sat nearly 15 miles beyond the dirt road where Emily's car had been discovered. Even deeper into the desert. Moreno studied the sketch carefully. "Did he say why he was there?" Jason shook his head. "But he told me something else." "What?" Jason swallowed. "He asked if I could help him the next morning." "Help him with what?" Jason's voice dropped. "He said he needed to move something." The word settled heavily in the room. "Move something." Moreno felt the truth pushing closer. "Did you go meet him?" she asked. Jason nodded slowly. "Yeah." "What time?" "Early. Around sunrise." "Where?" Jason pointed to the same spot on the map again. The quarry. The investigation had just taken its darkest turn yet. Moreno kept her voice calm. "When you got there, what did you see?" Jason's eyes closed for a moment. 23 years of silence seemed to weigh down every word he was about to say. His truck was there, he said quietly. And Emily's car. Maureen's pen stopped moving. Her car was there. Jason nodded. Yes. That detail rewrote the entire sequence of events. For decades, investigators believed Emily's Honda Civic had been abandoned exactly where it was found. But Jason's statement suggested something different. The car had been moved. First to the quarry. Then later to the desert road where the rancher found it. Which meant Michael had been driving that car during the night. And possibly transporting something inside it. Maureen asked the question she had been avoiding. Did you see Emily? Jason's hands trembled slightly. No. Did Michael say where she was? Jason shook his head slowly. He didn't say her name. What did he say? Jason stared at the map again. Then he whispered the sentence that had haunted him for 2 decades. He said he messed up. Maureen let the silence fill the room. Because sometimes the truth in a cold case doesn't arrive in dramatic confessions. It arrives in small, broken sentences. 3 simple words. I messed up. And somewhere beyond that abandoned quarry, in the Arizona desert, the rest of the story was still waiting to be uncovered. The words Jason Miller spoke in the interview room hung in the air long after he said them. I messed up. 3 words. 3 quiet words that carried the weight of 23 years. For decades, investigators had searched the desert believing Emily Carter's car had been abandoned exactly where it was discovered. Now the timeline had changed again. The car had been somewhere else first. The quarry. Detective Lisa Maureen drove out there 2 days later with a small team of investigators. The quarry sat far beyond the outskirts of Mesa, hidden behind miles of dirt roads that twisted through barren hills and dry ravines. It was the kind of place locals knew about, but rarely talked about, an old mining site abandoned long before the 1990s. The entrance looked almost forgotten. Rusting metal fencing leaned sideways against wooden posts. The ground was scattered with broken rock and old tire tracks hardened by decades of sun. Maureen parked at the edge of the site and stepped out. Wind rolled through the quarry floor, carrying the dry smell of stone and dust. This was where Jason said Michael Carter had been the morning after Emily disappeared. Where he had asked for help. Where Emily's car had supposedly been sitting before it appeared later on that desert road. Maureen walked slowly toward the center of the quarry. The ground sloped downward into a wide basin carved into the earth. Old equipment lay scattered around the edges, rusted metal beams, broken concrete slabs, pieces of machinery that had not moved in years. If someone wanted to hide something here, there were countless places to do it. The search began immediately. Cadaver dogs moved carefully across the rocky ground while investigators spread out along the quarry walls. 4 hours they found nothing. Just dust. Stone. Silence. But near the far edge of the quarry basin, one of the dogs suddenly stopped. The animal froze beside a patch of uneven ground partially hidden beneath loose rocks. The handler raised a hand. The signal was unmistakable. Something was buried there. Investigators moved in carefully with shovels and excavation tools. The first few inches revealed nothing but dry soil and gravel. Then a piece of fabric appeared. Faded. Torn. The digging slowed immediately. Evidence technicians replaced the shovels with smaller hand tools. Within minutes, another shape emerged beneath the dirt. Bone. The remains were incomplete, scattered and fragile after decades underground, but there was no doubt what investigators were looking at. Human skeletal remains. Moreno stood silently at the edge of the excavation as the team worked. The desert wind moved softly across the quarry floor. 23 years earlier, a young woman had vanished without a trace. Now the desert was finally giving her back. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office for analysis. Even after all those years, forensic scientists were able to confirm the identity using DNA comparison with Emily Carter's family. The results came back quickly. Positive identification. Emily Carter had been buried in the quarry. The autopsy findings were limited due to the condition of the remains, but investigators discovered something critical. A fracture on the left side of the skull. Blunt force trauma. The injury was severe enough to cause death. The quiet disappearance from 1999 was now officially a homicide. Detective Moreno returned to the interview room with Jason Miller the next day. This time the conversation was different. The evidence from the quarry had shattered the last barrier between suspicion and truth. Jason already knew. News travels fast in small circles, and the moment investigators began excavating the quarry, word started spreading. Jason sat across from Moreno looking pale. "You found her," he said quietly. Moreno nodded. "Yes." Jason closed his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Moreno asked the question that had waited for decades. "Jason, tell me exactly what happened that morning." Jason's voice trembled slightly. "When I got to the quarry, Michael was already there." "Was Emily's car there?" "Yes." "Where was she?" Jason looked down at the table. "In the trunk." The room went completely still. Moreno didn't interrupt. Jason continued. He opened it. His hands shook as he spoke. She wasn't moving. Moreno felt the weight of the moment settle into the room. "Did he say what happened?" Jason nodded slowly. "He said they were arguing in the car." "What about?" "About the stolen cars, about her telling the police." Jason swallowed hard. "He said she tried to get out while they were driving." Moreno leaned forward slightly. "And then?" Jason's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "He said he grabbed something from the seat." "What?" "A wrench. The kind of tool every mechanic keeps within reach." Jason continued. "He said he only meant to scare her." Moreno had heard versions of that sentence many times before. "I didn't mean to do it. I only meant to scare them." But violence rarely follows the plans people imagine in their heads. "What happened next?" she asked. Jason looked toward the wall. "He hit her." The words came slowly. "Once?" Jason's voice cracked slightly. "And then she stopped moving." For 23 years, Emily Carter's disappearance had remained a mystery. Now the truth was finally coming into focus. A fight between siblings. A desperate secret. A moment of anger inside a moving car. And a single violent strike that ended a life. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because somewhere in Arizona, Michael Carter was still living quietly with the knowledge of what happened that night. And very soon the police were coming back for him. Cold cases don't end with discoveries. They end with doors opening in the middle of the night. By the time detectives finished interviewing Jason Miller, the story of July 17, 1999, had finally taken shape, piece by piece, memory by memory, evidence rising slowly out of the desert. Emily Carter discovered something she was never supposed to know. Her brother Michael had been moving stolen cars through the outskirts of Mesa. A quiet side business hidden behind the ordinary rhythm of his life as a mechanic. Cars stripped, parts sold, vehicles temporarily hidden in remote corners of the desert. Emily confronted him. First in the garage that afternoon. Then again later that night. Somewhere between the bookstore where she worked and the empty desert road where her car would eventually be found, the argument followed them into the dark. The fight moved into the car. Anger escalated. And one swing of a wrench ended everything. Jason Miller's statement, combined with the DNA evidence from the trunk and the skeletal remains recovered from the quarry, gave prosecutors something they had never had before. A complete narrative. But there was one final step left. Michael Carter had to be arrested. The warrant was signed quietly by a judge late that afternoon. Detective Lisa Moreno held the document in her hand for a moment before leaving the courthouse. The paper felt heavier than it should have. 23 years of unanswered questions had been condensed into a single sheet of legal authority. Somewhere in Tucson, Michael Carter was finishing another ordinary day. Maybe he was eating dinner. Maybe watching television. Maybe thinking about nothing at all. But the past was already on its way back to him. The drive south took nearly 2 hours. By the time detectives reached the quiet residential street where Michael lived, the sky had turned black. Streetlights cast pale circles across the pavement. The house looked ordinary. A single-story building with faded paint and a small yard covered in gravel. The kind of place no one would ever associate with a decades-old murder investigation. 2 patrol cars parked quietly down the block. Detectives approached the front door. Moreno knocked once. Then again. Inside, footsteps moved across the floor. The door opened slowly. Michael Carter stood in the doorway wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Moreno said the words she had been waiting years to say. "Michael Carter, you're under arrest for the murder of Emily Carter." The silence that followed felt endless. Michael didn't run. He didn't argue. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly. Like a man who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. Officers placed him in handcuffs. The metallic click echoed softly on the quiet street. Neighbors peeked through their windows as the patrol car lights flashed once across the houses. Inside the vehicle, Michael sat motionless. The desert wind moved faintly across the street. For 23 years, he had carried the memory of what happened that night. Now the secret was gone. Back at the station, detectives conducted the final interview. Michael sat in the same kind of room where countless suspects before him had tried to hold on to their stories. Moreno placed a folder on the table. Inside were the photographs from the quarry. The forensic reports. Jason Miller's statement. Michael stared at the images for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't mean to kill her." The sentence came quietly. Almost exhausted. Moreno didn't interrupt. Michael continued. "She found out about the cars, said she was going to tell the police." His voice trembled slightly. "We started arguing in the car. She tried to get out while I was driving." He rubbed his face slowly. "I grabbed the wrench, I just wanted her to stop yelling." The room stayed silent. "I only hit her once." That single moment had echoed across 23 years. One violent decision that destroyed 2 lives, Emily's, and the brother who would spend decades trying to bury the truth beneath the desert. Michael described what happened next. He realized Emily wasn't breathing. Panic took over. He placed her in the trunk and drove through the desert roads he knew so well. Eventually he reached the quarry. He buried her there during the night. The next morning, he called Jason to help move the car. They drove the Honda Civic to the dirt road where it would later be discovered by a rancher. Abandoned. Silent. A puzzle investigators would struggle to solve for decades. Michael finished speaking and lowered his head. For the first time in more than 20 years, the story had finally been told out loud. Outside the interview room, detectives listened quietly. Cold cases rarely end with dramatic revelations. Most end like this. With tired voices. With quiet admissions. With the slow realization that the past never truly disappears. News of the arrests spread quickly across Mesa. Residents who remembered the missing person flyers from 1999 watched the headlines appear again. Emily Carter's name returned to the news. But this time, the story had an ending. The desert had kept its secret for a long time. Wind had covered the ground. Sand had hidden the evidence. Years had passed while a family waited for answers. But secrets have a strange way of resurfacing. Sometimes through forgotten evidence. Sometimes through memories people can no longer carry alone. And sometimes through the quiet persistence of investigators who refuse to let a story fade. In the end, Emily Carter was no longer just a photograph on an old missing person poster. She was a young woman whose life had been taken in a moment of anger. A sister whose truth had been buried beneath stone and dust. And a cold case that finally broke open after 23 long years. Out in the Arizona desert, the wind still moves across the empty roads where her car was once found. The landscape looks the same as it did in 1999. Endless. Silent. But somewhere beneath that quiet surface, the past has finally been uncovered. Long after the arrest, the silence didn't disappear. It simply changed shape. For 23 years, the Emily Carter case had been defined by absence. A missing person poster, a car abandoned in the desert, a family waiting for answers that never came. Now there were answers. But answers don't erase what was lost. They only illuminate it. In the weeks following Michael Carter's arrest, the story spread across Arizona like a shockwave. Local news stations replayed the same footage again and again. Police vehicles outside a quiet Tucson house, detectives walking a handcuffed man toward a patrol car, reporters standing in front of the old quarry where investigators had finally uncovered what the desert had hidden for decades. People in Mesa remembered Emily. Some remembered the summer of 1999 clearly. The flyers stapled to telephone poles. The candlelight vigil in the park. The uneasy conversations parents had with their children about staying safe at night. Others had been too young back then, learning about the case for the first time through the headlines now flashing across television screens and social media feeds. But everyone reacted the same way when they heard the final detail. The man responsible was her brother. The revelation hit the Carter family like a second earthquake. Robert and Linda Carter had spent more than 2 decades grieving a daughter whose fate they never understood. They had spoken to detectives countless times. They had pleaded for tips from strangers. They had endured the quiet cruelty of unanswered questions. Now they were facing something almost impossible to process. Their daughter had been killed by their son. When detectives informed them of Michael's confession, the room reportedly fell completely silent. Linda Carter later described the moment in a short statement released through the prosecutor's office. "There are no words for this kind of pain," she said. For years they had imagined countless possibilities about Emily's disappearance, strangers, accidents, unknown dangers waiting somewhere in the dark. The truth had been sitting at their dinner table. The trial began nearly a year later. By then the case had become one of the most talked about cold case breakthroughs in Arizona. Prosecutors laid out the timeline carefully for the jury. The argument between Emily and Michael in the garage. The phone call at 9:58 p.m. The fight inside the car. The wrench. The trunk. The long drive into the desert. Jason Miller's testimony became one of the most critical moments of the trial. He described arriving at the quarry that morning in 1999, seeing the Honda Civic parked near the edge of the pit, and watching Michael open the trunk. The courtroom reportedly went completely still, as he described the moment he realized Emily was inside. Defense attorneys attempted to challenge his credibility, pointing out the decades that had passed since the event. But the forensic evidence told the same story. Emily's blood in the trunk. Michael's DNA beside it. And the skeletal remains discovered exactly where Jason said they would be. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. The verdict came back late in the afternoon. Guilty. Second-degree murder. Michael Carter stood silently as the judge read the decision. For a moment he glanced toward the back of the courtroom where his parents sat today. But neither of them looked at him. Sentencing came weeks later. The judge spoke quietly before delivering the final punishment. "This crime destroyed a life and shattered a family," he said. Michael Carter was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The courtroom emptied slowly after the hearing. Detective Lisa Moreno remained near the back of the room, watching as the final chapter of the case closed. For her, the investigation had lasted only a few years. But the story had begun decades earlier. Cold cases often outlive the people who start them. Detectives retire. Evidence gathers dust. Witnesses move away. But sometimes, if the right person opens the file again, the story finds its way back into the light. Months after the trial, Emily Carter's remains were finally returned to her family for burial. The funeral was small. Quiet. Many of the people who attended had also been there in 1999, when the search for her first began. Now, instead of candles and missing posters, they gathered around a grave. The desert wind moved softly through the cemetery as Emily was laid to rest. A life that ended in violence. A mystery that lasted 23 years. And a secret that could not stay buried forever. Even today, the dirt road where Emily's car was found looks almost exactly the same as it did that summer night in 1999. Drivers pass through the area without knowing the story that unfolded there. The desert holds its silence well. But sometimes, beneath that silence, history waits. Waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Waiting for a small detail to resurface. Waiting for the moment when a cold case file opens again, and the truth finally steps out of the shadows. Cold cases rarely disappear. They simply fall silent. Somewhere inside police storage rooms across America, thousands of cardboard boxes sit stacked on metal shelves. Each one holds a story that stopped in the middle: photographs, transcripts, evidence bags, handwritten notes from detectives who once believed they were only days away from the truth. The Emily Carter file had lived in one of those boxes for years. Dust settled on the edges of the folder. Investigators changed departments. Some retired. Some moved across the country. New cases replaced old ones. New crimes demanded attention. And slowly, quietly, the investigation faded into the background of the system. But it never completely vanished. Every so often, a detective reopening old records would pause on the same question that had haunted the case from the beginning. How does a young woman disappear into the desert without leaving a single clear trail? The car. That abandoned Honda Civic on the dirt road outside Mesa. It had always felt wrong. Too neat. Too staged. The kind of detail that whispers to investigators long after everyone else stops listening. For years, the car had been both the only clue and the biggest mystery. There were no signs of struggle outside. No footprints leading into the desert. No witness who saw Emily walking away. Just a silent vehicle parked beneath the Arizona sun. Now, decades later, detectives understood why. The scene had never been the beginning of the crime. It had been the final act of concealment. Michael Carter and Jason Miller left the car there deliberately, hoping the desert would do what it had done countless times before, erase the past. And for 23 years it almost worked. Almost. Because something else had survived the desert. Memory. Jason Miller had tried to forget what he saw at the quarry. He built a life far away from that moment. Different jobs. Different cities. Different routines. But memory has a strange habit of resurfacing when people least expect it. The human mind is not built to carry certain secrets forever. Some eventually push their way back into the light. That small fracture in Jason's silence was enough to reopen the entire case. One conversation. One interview. One reluctant admission that the car had not been where investigators originally believed. From there, the truth began to unravel quickly. The quarry. The remains. The confession. A cold case that had slept for more than 2 decades suddenly erupted back into the present. For the detectives who worked the case in its final years, the experience left a permanent mark. Lisa Moreno later described the moment the cadaver dog stopped near the buried remains as something she would never forget. "You always hope," she said in a quiet interview after the trial. But hope and reality are very different things. Finding Emily Carter in the desert meant the mystery was finally solved. But it also meant confronting the violence that had ended her life. Cold cases are strange like that. They carry 2 kinds of closure at the same time. Answers. And grief. For the Carter family, the years after the trial were filled with both. Emily's parents rarely spoke publicly again. Friends said the confirmation of what happened gave them peace, but it also forced them to relive a tragedy they had spent decades trying to survive. There is no easy language for a crime like this. A brother. A sister. A moment of anger that spiraled into irreversible violence. The kind of tragedy that doesn't just destroy a life, it fractures an entire family history. In prison interviews conducted years later, Michael Carter rarely spoke about the case. When he did, his words were brief. Measured. Almost hollow. "I wish I could take it back," he once told a corrections counselor. But time does not move backward. It moves forward. Carrying the consequences of every moment with it. Today, if you drive along the same desert road where Emily's car was discovered in 1999, there is nothing that marks the place. No sign. No memorial. Just open land stretching toward the horizon. Wind moves across the sand. Tire tracks fade quickly beneath the sun. The desert looks exactly the way it did the night Emily Carter vanished. That's one of the strange things about crime scenes in remote places. Nature doesn't remember them. The earth doesn't preserve the story. Only people do. And sometimes those memories lie dormant for years, buried in evidence boxes, in old police reports, in the quiet corners of someone's conscience. Until one day, something shifts. A new detective opens a file. A witness finally speaks. A fragment of truth rises slowly through decades of silence. And suddenly the past is no longer buried. The Emily Carter investigation began with a missing person flyer taped to a streetlight in the summer heat of 1999. It ended with a quiet courtroom verdict more than 20 years later. Between those two moments lived a story of secrecy, fear, guilt, and the stubborn determination of investigators, who refused to let the desert keep its secret forever. Cold cases are often described as puzzles. But they are something else too. They are echoes. Echoes of lives interrupted. Echoes of questions that refuse to fade. Echoes that linger in the minds of detectives, families, and communities long after the headlines disappear. And sometimes, just sometimes, those echoes grow loud enough to lead someone back to the truth. Back to the place where the story really began. A late summer night. A car moving down a dark Arizona road. Two voices arguing inside. And a single moment that would send a young woman into the desert, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the state for more than 2 decades. Even now, long after the trial and the prison sentence, the memory of that case still circulates quietly among investigators who study unsolved crimes. Because it carries a reminder they never ignore. Some secrets survive for years. Some hide beneath dust, distance, and silence. But the truth has a way of waiting patiently. And when the moment finally arrives, even the coldest case can come back to life. Years pass. Cities grow. Roads change. People move on. But some stories refuse to disappear. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, the Emily Carter case continued to echo quietly through Arizona's criminal justice community. Detectives who worked the investigation eventually returned to other cases. New files replaced old ones. Fresh crimes demanded attention. But every now and then, someone would mention the same case again. The cold case that slept for 23 years. The sister who vanished into the desert. The brother who carried the truth longer than anyone imagined. For younger investigators just entering the profession, the file became something else entirely, a lesson. Because cases like Emily's are rarely about dramatic breakthroughs or sudden miracles. They are about patience. About persistence. About the quiet belief that even the smallest detail can reopen a door sealed by time. Detective Lisa Moreno often thought about the moment everything changed. Not the excavation at the quarry. Not the arrest in Tucson. But the interview with Jason Miller. The hesitation in his voice. The way he paused before admitting the car had been moved. Cold cases rarely crack open with explosions. They crack open with hesitation. A single sentence that doesn't match the story told for decades. A memory that refuses to stay buried. A witness who finally realizes that silence is heavier than truth. Jason Miller had lived with that weight for more than 2 decades. Friends later said he had never spoken about the quarry before detectives found him again. Not to co-workers. Not to neighbors. Not even to people who had known him for years. But guilt has its own gravity. Eventually, it pulls everything downward. When Jason finally told investigators about that morning in 1999, the investigation didn't just move forward, it accelerated. The quarry search. The skeletal remains. The confirmation through DNA. Each discovery peeled away another layer of silence, until the final story stood fully exposed. Emily Carter had not disappeared into the desert. She had been placed there. Hidden by someone who believed the landscape would swallow the evidence forever. For a long time, it almost did. The Arizona desert is vast. Miles of open land stretch beyond the edges of cities like Mesa and Tucson. Dirt roads vanish into the horizon. Old mining sites crumble slowly beneath the sun. Wind moves sand across the ground, erasing tracks within hours. Investigators searching for missing people often describe the desert as both beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful because of its silence. Terrifying because it can keep secrets indefinitely. In Emily's case, the desert nearly succeeded. Nearly. But one small fracture in the story changed everything. A witness who finally spoke. A detective who listened carefully enough to hear the difference between truth and memory. And a team willing to follow that difference all the way into an abandoned quarry. The moment Emily Carter's remains were recovered, the cold case officially transformed into something else. No longer a disappearance. A homicide. No longer a mystery. A crime with a name attached. But even solved cases carry lingering shadows. In the years since the trial, people who remember Emily still speak about her in quiet conversations. Co-workers from the bookstore recall her laugh. Friends remember late-night drives through Mesa during the hot desert summers. Teachers from her high school describe a young woman who loved reading and planned to travel someday. All of those ordinary details, the small pieces that form a life, were frozen in time the night she argued with her brother. A single moment of violence ended a future that had barely begun. Michael Carter now lives the rest of his life inside the rigid structure of the prison system. Days measured in routines. Years measured in sentences. For him, the desert night of July 1999 will never fully disappear. It exists permanently inside the memories he tried to bury. Inside the evidence recovered from the trunk of a car. Inside the testimony of a friend who could no longer carry the secret alone. And inside the quiet courtroom verdict that finally closed the case. Cold cases have a strange way of reshaping the communities they pass through. They linger. They become part of local memory. Even people who never met the victim sometimes feel connected to the story, as if the unanswered questions belonged to everyone. When those questions are finally resolved, the relief spreads far beyond the immediate family. It touches investigators who refuse to give up. Neighbors who remembered the missing posters. Strangers who followed the story in newspapers years ago. The solution doesn't erase the tragedy. But it restores something that had been missing. Truth. In the end, the Emily Carter investigation became something more than a solved murder. It became proof that time does not always defeat justice. Sometimes the truth waits quietly, hidden beneath layers of silence, until the right moment arrives. Until one person decides to speak. Until one detective decides to listen. Until the desert finally gives back what it tried to keep. Even now, drivers occasionally pass along that same lonely road outside Mesa where Emily's car was found all those years ago. Most of them never realize what happened there. They see only a stretch of dirt disappearing into the horizon. But beneath the quiet surface of that landscape lies the memory of a story that once shocked an entire community. A disappearance. A secret buried in stone. And a cold case that refused to stay frozen forever. Because some truths, no matter how deeply they are hidden, have a way of resurfacing. Slowly. Quietly. Relentlessly. Until the silence finally breaks.